everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on balancing competing deadlines, brought to you by the Academic Resource Center at Georgetown University. Today, we're going to be taking a look at how you can develop a map for multiple major assignments and be intentional about how you're working on them side by side. One mistake that students make is that they plan each assignment on its own and they don't look at all of their assignment deadlines side by side. So, the first point that we want to think about is how you can avoid planning each assignment in isolation. The first place to coming up with a plan is to assess when all of your major deadlines are taking place and to identify when you have time available to work towards these deadlines in the week beforehand. Thinking about final exams as an example, as that's a period that we're entering into, often students approach working on multiple major assignments as if they have the ideal final schedule. So here's what I would consider to be the ideal schedule. Maybe you have 5 assignments, but each assignment has a few days beforehand with nothing else where you need to focus on it. So if one paper is due April 29th and then a test is May 2nd and then the next paper is May 5th, these assignments are staggered so that you can spend 2 or 3 days beforehand focusing only on that one assignment, and you can develop your plan in one mental space and have that flow carry you through those days. And that's often how we approach planning, even when that's not how deadlines fall. So often, what a final schedule looks like is instead something like this, where the first paper, the first test, and the second paper might all be due on Tuesday, April 29th, which for this semester is still during classes, the last day of classes. And then 2 tests might occur on May 2nd, which is the first day of finals. We can't make a plan without seeing how the deadlines, we can't make a plan without seeing how the deadlines fall in relationship to one another, because otherwise it's not going to be realistic. With that in mind, looking at these days that we have leading up to this Tuesday, April 29th, where there are 3 major assignments, before we figure out how we're working on each of these assignments, we are going to identify the periods of time available to focus specifically on these assignments. And based on the time we have, we'll try to divide it up so that an equivalent amount of time is being dedicated to each of these 3 major assignments. So for starting today on a Wednesday and preparing for 3 assignments for next Tuesday, the time I have available on Thursday, tomorrow, 12 to 2 p.m., on Friday, 12 to 5 p.m., on Saturday, 10 to 5 p.m., Sunday, 3 to 9 p.m., and Monday we have 5 to 11 p.m. Before determining which assignments you're working on during each block, you want to create a task list for each major assignment. So do this by writing out the specific steps you need to take in order to get through each test and paper. This will look different for each individual assignments, but it will also look very different for your test prep versus your final paper prep. And presentation prep will look more like paper prep than it will test prep. For example, we have here a paper task list. This is something that's going to be a little more universal than the test prep list, where we list out all of the steps that you would need to do for writing a paper in order of the process that you would approach them. So here I'm beginning with brainstorming, developing a thesis, finding sources, outlining. These steps might vary depending on your particular process or just based on the assignment. So for this, where I have multiple sources, I want to do that before I outline, but there might be papers where you outline first. Maybe you develop the thesis after you outline or even after you write. So think about your own process. What I have done here, though, that I think is important to pass on is I've tried to break up the biggest step of writing into smaller stages. So instead of just saying I'm going to write, I have it by page, drafting first page, second, third, fourth. And depending on how much structure you need, you might break this down even further into write first paragraph, second paragraph. But having those specific goals is going to help you schedule your time more effectively. Your test prep task list is going to look a little bit different. For this, you should begin by writing out all of the materials you have available to study from, and then you want to rank them, prioritize them in order to see what is the most important, what is the least important. And how do we determine that? How do we determine what is most and least important? Basically, what do you find the most helpful? For this list, I have two practice tests available, and those to me are going to be the most helpful because they cover the necessary content and they also are going to help me be more active and practice that test format. So I consider those to be the most two important test prep tasks. Because I like the active tasks, I then have reviewing flashcards and then my problem sets, and reading notes I have as my final task. So with the paper, when we create a task list, we know we're going to get through we know we're going to get through all of those items. For the test prep task list, we might not get through all of these, and that's why it's important to figure out what's the most important so you can plan on including those first. After you've figured out the tasks that you need to complete, you want to determine how long it will take you to complete each task, which can be very unpredictable, but especially if you're preparing for finals, it is the end of the semester. And the best way to determine how long something will take you in the future is to assess how long it took you in the past. So if you need to figure out how long it will take you to write a page, how long has it taken you to write a page in the past? How long has it taken you to review your notes for a math class in the past? So don't try to force yourself into an ideal box of the student you want to be. Instead, think about the student who you have been and use that to help create a plan. The best plan is going to be a realistic plan. Now we play a bit of a matching game. You're going to match your available times with the items from your task list. So identify those specific goals for each study block based on your task lists, because these task lists are essentially to-do lists. And then plan to work on the most difficult assignments during the times when you work best. What that means is if you have a test and two papers, which assignment, I should say, is going to require the most mental energy? For me, it might be developing super specific ideas for these essays. That's something that's quite active, and I need to be creative, and that requires a lot of memory and a lot of mental energy. So, when is it that I work the best? It's going to be earlier. So, I'm going to try to do whatever I think the hardest heavy lifting with my papers is at the beginning of a study block so that my mind is fresh. In mapping out a plan, we have a few best practices here. One is to schedule out the time spent working on test preparation before you figure out when you're working on paper preparation. That's because the timing of test preparation is very important and should be planned meaningfully. You have probably heard before that you want to avoid cramming. That is because when you're cramming, you're just immersing yourself in the material for just the day before an exam. That information's going into your short-term memory, but it's not going into your long-term memory. Part of learning is forgetting. By studying material perhaps for a midterm and then letting time pass and now looking at information again, you are not only just looking at the material to make sure you understand it, but you're working on strengthening those connections in your brain to recalling that information. So you want to give yourself at least a week, maybe more time to allow yourself to familiarize yourself with the material, forget it, and re-remember it. So having more frequent but shorter test prep blocks is going to be more helpful than having fewer, longer test prep blocks. With that in mind, avoid going through test material chronologically unless it makes sense for the topic. If you're studying a history class, maybe you need to go through it from the beginning so that you can see how it builds on itself. But if you're studying for, let's say, a language exam, you should begin with the harder material, the material that you feel like you need the most practice with. This will, first of all, allow you to approach that material you need the most work on with more of your attention, and it will allow you to not rush it, but it will also allow you to review it multiple times. If you start with it on your first study day and then make time to look at it again in your last study day, you're going to be, again, engaging in that process of forgetting and remembering. So it'll give you more time to work through it with that particular topic. It's also important to aim for prioritization over perfectionism. And this can apply for all tasks, but maybe specifically for papers. Often for folks who approach paper writing with a sort of perfectionist streak, there can be a difficulty beginning working on a paper because you want it to be the best paper you've ever written. And a way to avoid the paralysis that can come from that kind of anxiety is to spread out the steps across multiple days or multiple study blocks even throughout the same day, because that will allow you to engage in the ideas knowing you have time later to come back and revise. You don't have to put pressure on yourself to make this perfect paper, because if you have time to revise it later, that means you have time to make it perfect later. It's also important to make sure you're adding in rest and meals as part of your study plan. That may sound like wishful thinking, but especially if you're taking exams, considering taking care of your body should be part of your test preparation. Not only will you perform better and will your anxiety be lower if you're actually well rested, but you process information while you sleep. So it's going to help with the study process. So it should be a priority as if it is part of your test preparation. So looking again at the sample study schedule we began on earlier, here we have our available study blocks for 5 days leading up to next Tuesday when I have 3 deadlines. I have a test at around noon, and then I have 2 papers due at midnight on Tuesday, and 5 days to do all of them. I I've made here my task list for each assignment. For my test, the most two important tasks are my practice tests. They are super important. And if I could do nothing else, I'd want to do them. But because the tests are going to be that second review, not my first review, I'm going to try to schedule those towards the end of my study session. That means I want to make sure I get that first review in there with problem sets 1, 2, and 3. If I had more time, I would try to review the flashcards and read through my notes, but I might not have time, so I'm not going to include that in my study plan as a must, but if I can fit them, I'll add them. Then I have my paper 1, which has 3 sources. For this, and it's a 5-page paper. This is the task list I showed you earlier, where I'm going to brainstorm and come up with my thesis before finding my sources. My second paper is a literature paper. I need quotes from a novel, but not outside sources. So for this, which will be in green on our schedule, I'm going to start by brainstorming and finding quotes, and then I'll outline and develop my thesis later. This is also a 4-page paper, so it's a little shorter and a little less intense. But again, as we move into our sample schedule, these are going to be color coded. Pink is my test, black is my harder paper, green is my less intense paper. So here we have our first 3 days. Thursday, I only have 2 hours. And as I mentioned beforehand, with test preparation, it's more important to do a little bit every day. So I'm just going to start with my first set of review. And on Thursday, 12 to 2 p.m., work on problem set 2. As you can see, I have a little bit of pink every day. And as I also mentioned, this is not my most difficult topic. And so I'm putting it at the end so that I can use my mental energy for what I think is the harder tasks for this particular schedule. So as you can see, Thursday 12 to 2, I have problem set 1. Friday 2:30 to 4:30 at the end of my study block, I have problem set 2. And Saturday 3 to 5 at the end of my study block, I have problem set 3. So I'm doing some of that review every day. Then on Friday, I have a big block of time where I want to focus on the more difficult essay because I want to get that started. So I have broken this down into these smaller, specific goals. 12 to 1, I'm going to work on brainstorming and developing my thesis. Specifically, I might try to do 30 minutes and 30 minutes, but I think these two ideas are kind of organically connected. And then from 1 to 2:30, I'm going to find 3 sources and outline. For purposes of this plan, as much as possible, I'm trying to work on as few assignments as possible per day because I find it easier to work on an assignment when I can get in that mental flow. So I'm hoping Friday to have this really productive paper session and then a study session, whereas it would be more difficult for me to work on both papers in one day, which I'll have to do in the following days. But right now we have a little bit more time. So Saturday, I'm going to do something a little bit similar. I'm going to brainstorm and find quotes and then develop thesis and an outline. Saturday, I have more time and I need to get work done. I don't have the luxury of spreading out the assignments across more than 5 days. So I know I need to start writing. Because this essay I'm starting on Saturday is easier, I'm going to try to write 3 pages on Saturday. That's because the essay I began on Friday, I have a little bit of that anxiety paralysis. So I want to work on it when I can use my best mental energy. So that's why I'm not working on that on Saturday. And then again, I have that problem set practice. So now looking at the second half of my study days. Sunday, I have from 3 to 9 p.m. to work. I need to work on this more difficult essay. So 3 to 6 p.m., I'm going to draft the first 3 pages of this more challenging essay. And then we're moving into the next phase of my test prep, which is taking the practice tests. So from 6 to 9 p.m., I'm going to take and review practice test 1. Monday is sort of an interesting day because I have class all day, and so I'm not going to begin working until 5 p.m. And I have until from 5 until 11, which is not ideal, but I still need to make significant progress on this day. So that means I'm actually going to start with taking and reviewing my second practice test because for Tuesday, my exam is at noon. If I get off the schedule with these essays, I'll have time to make that up, but I need to prioritize finishing this test prep. And again, I need to prioritize going to sleep. I cannot stay up until 3 in the morning when I have this exam the next day. So we're going to start with the practice test. Then I'm going to finish up my easier essay first because all I have to do is write my intro and conclusion, and I feel more confident that I'll be able to finish it in a short amount of time. And then I'm going to finish with the final 2 pages, and we're excited for my more difficult essay. I'm doing that last because I do anticipate it will take longer than I want it to. But I am okay letting it drag on maybe till midnight, maybe 12:30. After that, I'll have to call it quits. So with that in mind, knowing that I have an exam and I'm prioritizing sleeping, I actually have not scheduled much for Tuesday because I want to leave that time open for anything I might not have anticipated. Maybe I'm really behind on one essay, maybe one of them I got stuck on and I need to still write several pages. Maybe there's a concept for my exam that I need to review aggressively in the morning. So for test prep, I don't have anything specific planned other than taking my exam at 12. But I know if I really need to, I have that morning to study, and I'm leaving that block open intentionally. Then I'm planning just on revising these essays, the easier one in the afternoon and the more difficult one in the evening. But this time can transform if I needed to. So those blocks of time are intentionally vague. That's a good segue into this element of what's just part of having a plan, getting off track. By nature of having a study plan, I can almost guarantee you that you will get off of it at some point. You'll be tired, something will take you longer than you expect. My advice is to stick to your study block ending times, even if you're not finished with an assignment. A good example is, let's say you have 3 problem sets and each one covers a different chapter. If problem set 1 takes you 3 times longer than you think it will, and then you use 3 different blocks meant for 3 different problem sets on 1 problem set, that means you've only reviewed the material from 1 chapter. So you've gone really in depth with 1 section and ignored the other 2 sections. The same can apply to the essay writing process. Let's say you outline and you give yourself an hour for that process, but you only have half of your ideas figured out. When your hour is up, you haven't outlined everything. With that, there's a chance that the outlining is difficult because you are still not sure of how you want the ideas to shape up. So sometimes writing and moving on to the next step can actually help you develop those ideas better. With that in mind, if you get behind on a study task, I would recommend sticking to your study block ending times in order to ensure that you don't spend more time on a task that has already sucked up a lot of your time. That way, you'll make sure that you're at least working on all the different categories and paying attention to different topics. Part of that piece, though, is preemptively leaving some open-ended time blocks towards the end of your study period so that you can return to essential tasks that you're behind on. Do not schedule every minute of your study time. Leave some open-ended for to be determined at a future date tasks. So that is some beginning entryway points to balancing competing deadlines. If you have any questions, feel free to add them to the chat. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining me today and best of luck with final exams.